So yeah, in this talk, we're going to talk a bit about me and then how this talk came to be and this research. Then we're going to introduce you to Veeam. Then we're going to talk about some token handle exposure, dive into some of the custom protocols that Veeam uses, and then we're going to release 2 new tools. They're not public yet. They will be made public very soon after this, once we actually get Veeam to coordinate and work with us a little bit. I'm Phil Keeble. I work with Rio, a fan of weird wigs. I work at NetSPI. I lead the threat intelligence-led red teaming, so I lead the TIBERs, CBES, and those styles of engagements. I've talked at various conferences and released various tools, and also major credit to Ethical Chaos, who's not part of this talk, but he was a huge help in the research leading up to this talk. So why am I actually talking about this today? The Veeam is a very prevalent piece of software. It's an enterprise backup suite that's used all over the world in many different environments. There was a TLRT I was leading pretty recently, which had a red forest style design, very segmented. It was about 12 different domains, each domain with their certain roles, good segmentation between them, a very difficult environment to operate in. When we have those kind of environments, we like to look for tools that transcend network boundaries. One of those tools is SCCM, but in this case it was properly configured and locked down to, they had different SCCM sites for each one. But then there was also Veeam. During this engagement, we found that they had a Veeam controller that was collecting backups for all of their domains, breaking the red forest model. And we used that, we built a BOF during that, which will be the second tool we talk about for credential encryption to gain DA rights over all 12 domains. And then I was going to fluff this talk up a bit with just some other more basic stuff of like a bit of a story. But my research actually led to some pretty interesting vulnerabilities, leading to the other tool which we're going to release today. So Veeam, as I mentioned, is a backup and recovery suite. You have a backup server. That server will have a database on it. That database will store metadata about the backups and where they're stored. You'll then have the the locations of the backups. They'll be on storage servers. And then you'll have Veeam agents of varying kinds. So Veeam is very complex. It's a huge software stack. The Veeam can take backups primarily in 2 forms of ways. You can either back up a virtual machine or you can back up a physical server. If you back up a virtual machine, it will back up using the APIs for those hypervisors. So it will happen through ESXi, it will happen under the hood, it will take an image and it will store that. If it's a physical server, which is what we're going to focus on today, then it will install a Veeam agent directly on the client. And those Veeam agents can be managed or unmanaged, and they have 2 different privilege models, but we'll focus on the managed ones, which are the least privileged. But anything you can do in the least privileged, you can do in the most privileged. Move away from that one. So if we look at the Veeam server for setting up some of the lab environment, we can see, I think I have a laser. Hard to aim there. The Veeam server, we add protection groups. Protection groups are just logical groups of servers. When you add a server to a protection group, it will ask you for credentials. Those credentials, it can also be a certificate, but I've never seen Veeam implemented using certificate-based authentication. Every time I see Veeam, it's with creds. But you can see on the GUI there, it just says for admin creds. It's really vague. It doesn't tell you what it needs to be an admin to. You would assume that it would just need to be an admin to the server that you're adding, as I did, but you will find out you are wrong. This cert needs to be an admin also to the Veeam backup servers. This leads to most admins just supplying DA creds to Veeam because DA creds just work. When you actually have your protection group set up, you can then set up job policies to actually configure the backups and what happens. And when you apply hosts to these, it will install the Veeam agents on those hosts. When we look at the Veeam agent, if we compromise a server on a red team, we will already likely have system over that server. And this presents quite an interesting opportunity with the Veeam architecture, because the client actually has a lot of control over the server. So usually on the top screenshot, we can see when Veeam is just running idly, it will just run these 4 processes. These open a bunch of ports and are running things under the hood. But when an actual backup occurs, is what we see in the bottom screenshot. We'll see the Veeam endpoint service spawning the Veeam endpoint manager, and then that will spawn further Veeam agents and actually do the logic for about like 10 minutes. So when a backup happens, on the left-hand side, we can see the handles that are there in the Veeam endpoint service. For when it's just running idle, it just has a handle open for the normal system token. But after a backup occurs, you can see on the other screenshot, it will actually impersonate those credentials that you supplied earlier. It uses those credentials on the client, not on the server, to connect back to the server to upload backups. So you'll have a token exposed there in memory. Most of them it cleans up. There are a few, though, that it doesn't. So that kind of presents the first risk of, if you're on a Veeam server, on a client of a Veeam server, then you can just wait for a backup to occur, and then you can just use something like Token Stealer, or most C2s have this functionality built in as well. You can just steal the token, impersonate it into your own process. So here we're spawning CMD, but in a C2 context, that would just be giving it to your implant. And then you would have DA creds, exposing the first kind of major risk of Veeam's client design. What was interesting with this one, whilst that is impactful, that does mean for the Veeam client to make a token that it needs a clear text credential. So it has to know the password for that account to make this token. So these are either stored in a DB or a config file, or they have to be dynamically pushed to the client. So this was a kind of an interesting, this was where my research started deviating, and this wasn't how I expected Veeam to be doing things, because it's madness. But we started reverse engineering the Veeam endpoint service and the Veeam endpoint manager EXEs. Thankfully they're .NET, so reversing them was pretty trivial. But they are absolutely massive. The Veeam endpoint service is actually the main binary running on the server as well. So this is quite a weird design choice, where if you land on a Veeam client, you actually see the source code for the server on the other side as well, which is very strange. There are huge numbers of methods and classes in this. The attack surface of Veeam is humongous. The network protocols that it uses, there's RPC, there's .NET remoting, and then they also have a custom XML serialization protocol that they've designed. And that process, the custom protocol, is the one that handles the authentication flow with that client for credentials. So when we started digging into this custom protocol, and started looking at the XML methods that it exposes, we can kind of see the normal expected workflow here, where the Veeam service on the server it will stay waiting. It's waiting on about 10 different ports, but one of them, 10005, is waiting for these authentication hooks. When a backup job is started, it will connect to the client over RPC, and it will tell it to start a backup job. The client will then spawn the Veeam Manager EXE, as we saw earlier, but it will spawn it passing it 5 different GUIDs. The Veeam Manager.exe will then use the custom XML protocol to request it'll establish a TLS session using a certificate that's on the computer itself. Once it's done that, it will request a session, it will get back a session ID, it will then request DB access direct into the server using like these proxy functions. You'll then get back an accessor ID, and then it will request the credentials that it needs to use to send the data back to Veeam, and it will use one of those GUIDs as the opacity argument to kind of as the identifier of what credential it needs for its job. And then the server will provide back credentials. Those credentials then get DPAPI encrypted in memory, so it's not sitting in clear text in memory on the client. So they have kind of thought about that, but they haven't thought about adding any controls around this process. So for this process to work, the Veeam agent needs a few pieces of information. It needs to have a certificate that's installed on the client by default. So we can see in the top on the computer's store, as soon as you enroll a Veeam agent to exist, it will install a certificate from the Veeam backup service. It will also add registry keys to know what server do I need to talk to do these things. And then in the program data, you'll have all kinds of logs for backups, and you can find in those logs the 5 GUIDs that are passed to the manager process. So you can, if you land on a host, as long as these logs still exist, then you can find those GUIDs that it's asking about. Then the first tool, Veeam Beam, is a .NET POC that mimics the Veeam agent inside your implant. It will find the Veeam server from the registry. It will connect to it using the TLS certificate. It will then request the session IDs and DB accessor IDs that it's expected to request. And then it will request the credentials. So you passed one of the GUIDs from the logs earlier. You request the credentials, and it will just provide you the clear text credentials of the DA account. You can do this from any Veeam client as long as it's a physical server backup. So if you see those processes running earlier, you essentially have a free escalation to DA. So this is obviously very powerful. If you want to continue to pillage, so for example in the red theme I was talking about at the start, at this point you now have control over or you should have control over the Veeam server, because those credentials, like I mentioned earlier, are not what you would expect. So they should have access to the Veeam server. Then the Veeam server is going to have credentials for all of the other environments that it does backups for as well. So at this point, if you actually move to the Veeam server, you could then look through the registry to find the configuration for the database. So it could use Postgres or MS SQL. It can have different versions of those. And then you'll find further registry details about the connection info to use. And then on the bottom is just an excerpt from dbeaver, but that's just showing the credential database, how it's stored in Veeam. It has a somewhat custom encryption, but it ultimately falls down to DPAPI. But there are a few different encryption types that it can use depending on how old Veeam is. And you can identify those by the starter of the credential, whether it's a V or an A. So that comes on to the second tool, which is Veeam Decrypt. So this is a BOF. There are some public tools for Veeam decryption, but they usually only handle certain cases, whereas this BOF is in BOF format. In the screenshot, it's just compiled for an exe, but will be released as a BOF. This will check the registry for your database and all the details referencing inside there, which it needs to connect. It will then query the MS SQL or Postgres database for you. It will also handle the environment session data for you, so it will automatically find Postgres libraries on the host, load them into your process temporarily. Then it will pull down all the credentials. It will evaluate the credentials to see which encryption type it's using, then decrypt it appropriately, and you'll just get a table at the end with all the passwords decrypted in line. And in the case of the red team, I was performing DA of 12 different domains. One second. Okay, that's all right. So, okay. So preventing and detecting this attack. this is going to be extremely difficult. This is mimicking the way that Veeam works, so detecting it is going to be almost impossible because these connections are happening all the time across the environment if you have Veeam. There are some further checks Veeam could do. So, for example, the certificate that you have doesn't actually correlate to make sure that that certificate is on a host it expects. You could just export that certificate, put it on your own VM, SOX through, and do this as well, if you were concerned about like loading .NET into your process. So there's a few checks there, and they could check to make sure that that authentication call is actually happening when a backup is expected, because at the moment you can just call it whenever, and it will just give you those creds even if no backup is actually occurring. And those GUIDs, you can just pass whatever GUID you want. So if you somehow have the GUID of other credential objects, like someone exposed their logs on a network share or something, then you could just request those GUIDs too. To truly prevent this, Veeam would kind of have to fundamentally change how it works, and this is a huge, complex stack. The decisions they've made are very confusing for why those creds are even needed in the first place. To be honest, I'm kind of expecting these to be do not fixes from Veeam, because they are going to be very complex and difficult to fix. I have reached out to them, but they haven't responded. We will probably give them a few more pokes, because obviously this is very impactful, and we'll see. And it will get released when either they publish a fix, or if they say it's a do not fix, then it will just be released anyway, because it's clearly not a security problem. So that's my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Phil. So, does anyone have any questions?
First off, thank you so much for your presentation. That was fantastic. In your experience, testing, environments that you have, what is your pawn rate using Veeam in general when you see it? Are you confident that?
Fairly high, I would say. There's been it all depends on how before this research, it would kind of depend on whether you were lucky, if you could catch a token. So if Veeam was in the environment, then I would look for things like that token coming out. But you'd have to get lucky, right? Because you have to land on a server and be active within like a few hour window of when a backup occurs. So that's been difficult, but there have been quite a few environments where if Veeam is in this environment, I will be targeting Veeam. And because if you get onto Veeam somehow, usually it will be getting onto it through some other means, like compromising some other server admin. But kind of that second tool with the Veeam decrypt is a very high, right? You almost guarantee DA creds across the board. So definitely a worthwhile investment for you to look at in a red team.
Thank you.
Okay, so does anyone have any other questions? Okay, thank you, Phil.